The first blizzard did not destroy the old cabin, but it was enough for the Navy SEAL to understand that this place could not save anyone. The wind slipped through every crack in the wood, cold as a blade, while his German shepherd kept staring silently toward the rock crevice deep in the forest. He realized that if they stayed in that cabin, the next storm could take both their lives. So he did what the whole town called insane. He tore down the cabin to build a shelter before the cave. People laughed at him, saying no one lives in stone just to hide from snow and wind. But when the real superstorm arrived, the same people who mocked him had to call over the radio, trembling and begging for help. Where are you watching from? Please like, subscribe, and help us reach 1,000 followers so we can keep creating meaningful stories. Now, let's begin. Ethan Hale reached the northern Montana Preserve just after noon, when the winter light still looked harmless. It spilled over the pine tops in pale gold, turning the snow along the road into something almost gentle. The sky was clear enough to fool a man who had not learned better. Far beyond the tree line, the mountains rose blue and white, silent as old judges. The forest below them seemed peaceful, but Ethan knew peace could be a costume. He had seen quiet places become violent without raising their voices first. He drove a battered dark green pickup along the last narrow service road, the tires crunching over frozen ruts. Beside him, Coda sat upright in the passenger seat, not restless, not excited. The German shepherd was 6 years old, broad-chested and lean in the way of working dogs built for endurance rather than display. His coat was cream gray, with darker gray along his back and shoulders, the pale fur around his chest catching the light whenever he moved. His amber eyes watched the trees with a stillness that felt almost human, though Ethan knew better than to give mystery too much credit. Dogs did not need mystery. They had noses, ears, instinct, and a loyalty so clean it made most human promises look overdressed. Coda wore a black harness with deep red trim, practical and worn at the edges, with a top handle Ethan had used more than once in terrain that did not forgive mistakes. The dog's ears lifted as they climbed higher. His nose worked once against the window seam. Ethan noticed. He noticed everything. That had once been his job. Before this place, before the preserve, before the small classified pieces of his life were folded away into silence, he had been a Navy SEAL. 35 years old now, he still carried that old discipline in the set of his shoulders and the way his eyes measured distance. He stood about 6 feet tall, lean and compact, the strength in him practical rather than ornamental. His face was clean-shaven, hard-lined, with a square jaw and defined cheekbones. Dark brown hair, cut military short but slightly longer than regulation, lay close to his head. His skin was light but weathered by northern cold, and his gray-blue eyes held the look of a man who had seen many things and judged fewer than people expected. He wore the only outfit that made sense for the work. An old military gray tactical combat shirt, the fabric softened and faded by hard weather and repeated washing. The cuffs and shoulders frayed in small, honest places. Beneath it, a dark red thermal shirt showed at the collar, warmer in color than anything else about him. His combat pants were earth brown with moss green tones, the knees worn, the cargo pockets sagging slightly from use. Old military work boots gripped the floorboards. A battered military watch circled his left wrist, its face scratched but faithful. The cabin appeared where the road ended. At first glance, it seemed smaller than it should have been. It stood in a clearing between black pines, its roof sloping under a crust of old snow, its walls made of weathered timber gone gray with age. A narrow porch leaned forward as though listening for a sound it did not like. One window had been boarded and unboarded so many times that the frame looked tired of being asked to hold. Smoke did not rise from the chimney. No footprints crossed the yard except old animal tracks and one set of human boot marks already softened by wind. Ray Caldwell waited beside a white preserve truck with the engine running. Ray was in his early 50s, thick through the torso, with a square face reddened by years outdoors and a mustache trimmed short above a mouth that seemed built for practical statements, not comfort. His hair had gone iron gray at the temples, and he wore a heavy brown canvas coat with the preserve patch stitched on one sleeve. He was not cruel, Ethan decided at once, but he was the kind of man who had learned to divide the world into budget lines, weather warnings, and problems that could be postponed until someone else stood in front of them. Ray watched Ethan step out of the truck, then looked at Coda as the dog dropped lightly into the snow. "That him?" Ray asked. "Coda," Ethan said. The dog stood beside Ethan's leg, eyes moving from Ray to the cabin to the tree line. Ray gave a short nod. "Looks steadier than the last two caretakers." Ethan looked toward the cabin. "They leave early?" "One made it 6 weeks. One made it 12 days. Ray said it without pride or apology. Cabin's officially listed as a winter post, but it was built for summer crews and fall patrols. Nobody with a pencil ever slept through January here. That why the job was open? Ray's mouth shifted. It might have been a smile in warmer country. That. And the pay's bad. Coda moved before either man did. He crossed the clearing with his head low, paws silent in the packed snow, circling the cabin not like a pet exploring a new place, but like a sentry measuring a weak perimeter. Ethan let him go. There were men who pulled dogs back from every instinct and then wondered why the animal stopped warning them. Ethan had learned long ago that Coda rarely wasted movement. Ray noticed the silence between them and filled it with facts. Your duties are simple. Check the old boundary markers once a week if weather allows. Radio in treefall or illegal access. Watch the lower trail gates. If tourists get lost where they shouldn't be, you call it in before you play hero. Ethan looked at him. Ray lifted both hands slightly. I read your file. Enough of it. That wasn't an insult. It was a request. I understand requests. Good. Ray glanced at the cabin. There's firewood in the shed, though not enough. The radio works if the antenna isn't iced. The stove draws most days. Door sticks when the temperature drops hard. Roof leaks near the back corner in thaw. That all? Ray looked at him then, more carefully. No. The wind comes down that cut. He pointed toward a dark break between the trees beyond the clearing. Northwest. It doesn't hit like normal wind. It slides under things, around things, finds seams. You'll think you fixed it, then it finds another. Coda had stopped at the north side of the cabin. His ears stood high. His body had gone still. Ethan's gaze moved to him. For a moment, nothing happened. The forest held its breath. Then a light gust came through the trees, soft enough to barely stir the snow on the porch roof. But Coda's fur lifted along his neck as if something colder than the gust had touched him. Ethan felt it half a second later. Not wind exactly. Pressure. A thin, deliberate finger of air moved along the ground and slipped under the cabin's lower wall. The boards gave a faint, dry tick. Ray saw Ethan looking. Like I said, he muttered. It talks. Ethan did not answer. He had heard places talk before. Ships, ruined buildings, desert compounds with bad walls and worse exits. They never spoke in words. They spoke in pressure, vibration, heat, silence. A man survived by listening before the first shout. Inside, the cabin smelled of cold ash, old pine, mouse dust, and abandonment. There was a narrow iron stove near the center, a rough table against one wall, a bunk with a thin mattress, a cracked wash basin, shelves holding 2 rusted tins and a chipped mug. The floorboards flexed under Ethan's boots, not dangerously, but enough to remind him they were tired. Ray stood near the door as if unwilling to be claimed by the room. "You can make it better," he said. "Last guy didn't know a hammer from a prayer. I'll fix what needs fixing." "That's the spirit." Ray's tone tried for humor and missed. Preserve can reimburse small materials, nails, hinges, tar paper, nothing major unless I approve it. Ethan nodded. Ray handed him a folded map, a keyring, and a laminated card with emergency radio channels. His hands were rough and capable, but Ethan saw the old habit there too. Ray gave responsibility like a man dropping weight from his own shoulders. Before leaving, Ray paused on the porch. "One more thing. Don't take it personal if town gives you grief. Northridge likes testing newcomers. They'll say this post is cursed." "Is it?" Ray looked at the trees, then at the cabin, then back at Ethan. "No," he said. "Just neglected. Folks confuse the two when they don't want to pay for repairs." He climbed into the preserve truck and drove away, the engine fading into the pines until only the clearing remained. Ethan stood alone with Coda and the old cabin. For the first hour, he worked without thinking about the loneliness of it. That was the mercy of labor. He unloaded tools, stacked supplies, checked the stovepipe, pried loose warped boards near the porch, and cleared snow from the back wall. He found places where mice had nested in insulation that should have been replaced years ago. He found a roof seam patched badly with tin. He found the door frame out of square by almost half an inch. A weaker man might have cursed. Ethan only made a list. By late afternoon, he had a fire going. The stove smoked at first, then settled into a low orange burn. Warmth gathered in the room slowly, suspicious of staying. Outside, the sunlight thinned behind the pines, and the shadows grew longer across the clearing. Coda lay near the door, not sleeping, his head resting between his paws. Every few minutes, his ears twitched toward the north wall. Ethan watched him over the rim of a tin cup of coffee, gone bitter. "You hear it too," he said quietly. Coda did not look back. That was answer enough. As darkness arrived, the cabin changed. In daylight, its flaws had been visible and ordinary. At night, they became intentions. The wind came down from the northwest just as Ray had said, first in loose breaths, then in steady strokes that pressed against the trees until their trunks groaned. Snow dust hissed across the porch. The patched roof creaked above him. Somewhere in the wall, a nail worked slowly against old wood with a sound like a tooth worrying loose. Ethan sat on the bunk and listened. The stove burned. The room should have warmed. Instead, cold moved low across the floor, searching under the table, climbing the legs of the chair, touching the edge of his boots. He stood and crossed to the door, crouching beside Coda. The dog had placed his body along the bottom seam, not dramatically, not like a frightened animal, like a soldier blocking a breach. Ethan put his hand near the lower frame. A narrow blade of cold slid over his knuckles. There it was. He packed cloth into the seam, then drove 2 temporary wedges into place. The draft lessened. The cabin gave a small wooden sigh, almost grateful. For a while, that should have been enough. But near midnight, Ethan woke from a shallow sleep to a sound he could not name. Coda was standing. Not at the door now. At the window. His silhouette was rigid against the faint gray light outside. His ears were forward, his mouth closed, his body held in that strange, suspended way dogs had when instinct gathered all their thoughts into one point. Ethan rose without turning on the lantern. Beyond the glass, the clearing lay under moonlit snow. The forest stood black and silver. Nothing moved except wind-driven powder sliding over the ground. Then Koda made a low sound. Not a growl, not a bark. A warning held behind the teeth. Ethan followed the line of the dog's gaze. At the far edge of the clearing, where the trees thickened toward the dark ridge, the snow swirled differently. It did not blow straight. It curled sideways, then flattened, then vanished into the trees as if being pulled through a hidden mouth. Ethan leaned closer. For a moment, the moonlight caught something beyond the pines, dark stone, partly concealed, rising behind the timber. The shape was gone almost immediately behind moving snow, but Koda kept staring, and Ethan felt, with a tightening behind his ribs, that the dog had not been listening to the cabin at all. He had been listening beyond it. The thought stayed with him until morning. When dawn came, it came pale and hard. Ethan stepped outside with an axe in one hand and a coil of rope over his shoulder. He had repairs to make before the next night: door frame, roof seam, lower wall, stove draw. The list was clear. The work was honest. Still, Koda did not follow him to the woodpile. The dog crossed the clearing instead. Ethan stopped. "Koda!" The German shepherd paused but did not return. He looked back once, amber eyes steady, then turned toward the trees. There was no panic in him, no disobedience either. Not really. Only certainty. Ethan had followed men into danger for worse reasons than that. He set the axe down. The wind moved low across the clearing, dragging loose snow over his boots. Behind him, the old cabin waited with its patched walls and stubborn little stove, trying to be a shelter. Ahead, Koda's paw prints led into the forest, clean and deliberate beneath the cold morning light. Ethan stood between them for one breath longer. Then he followed the dog. Koda did not run as if he were fleeing. That was the first thing Ethan noticed. The German shepherd moved with purpose through the pines, his cream-gray coat slipping between dark trunks and white ground like a shadow that had learned discipline. His paws landed cleanly, leaving deep, certain prints in the fresh snow. He did not pause to sniff every branch or bury his nose into the drifts the way a younger dog might have. His ears stayed forward, catching whatever sound had drawn him away from the cabin. Ethan followed at a steady pace, not calling him back. The morning air was bright and brittle. It cut into his lungs with every breath, but the cold had a clean edge now, different from the stale cold that had crawled along the floorboards through the night. Out here, at least, the cold was honest. It came from the sky, from the snow, from the frozen bark of the trees. It did not pretend to be shelter. The forest north of the cabin rose gradually toward a broken ridge. Tall lodgepole pines stood close together, their dark needles carrying small shelves of snow. Here and there, fallen trunks lay half-buried, their bark split open by old seasons. The ground was uneven beneath the snow, hard with stone and roots. Ethan's boots found the safe places without much thought. Years of moving through hostile terrain had left a map inside his muscles. Koda stopped near a shallow dip where animal tracks crossed each other in confused lines. Ethan slowed. The dog's head lowered. His tail stiffened. A blur of white-brown movement broke from the base of a deadfall. A snowshoe hare. It shot across the snow in sharp, panicked bursts, oversized hind feet kicking powder behind it as it zigzagged between roots and stones. Its coat had gone mostly winter white, though a few brown patches remained along its back, like the forest had not finished painting it. Its black-tipped ears flicked once before it bolted uphill. Koda lunged. It was instinct, pure and immediate, not mystery, not prophecy. Just a working dog's body answering movement before thought could dress itself in language. "Koda," Ethan said once, low. The dog did not fully ignore him. Ethan saw the faint twitch in one ear. But the hare cut left through the trees, and Coda followed, powerful but controlled, not barking, not frantic. He chased because he was a dog, because the world had offered motion, and because even disciplined creatures still carried wildness under the skin. Ethan moved after them. The chase did not last long. The hare knew the ground better. It climbed through a field of broken granite, where the snow thinned, and the stones jutted out in jagged gray shoulders. It slipped between two boulders, vanished for half a heartbeat, then reappeared higher up before diving toward a narrow split in the rock. Coda reached the stone a few seconds later. Then he stopped. The change was so sudden, Ethan almost reached for his sidearm out of old habit. Coda stood at the mouth of a narrow crevice between two dark granite faces. His body remained angled forward, but he did not push in after the hare. His ears lifted. His nose worked. The fur along his neck rose slightly, not in aggression, but in response to something his body could measure better than Ethan's mind. The hare was gone. Coda did not care anymore. That mattered. Ethan climbed the last few yards carefully, one hand brushing the cold stone for balance. The rock here was old and hard, veined with darker mineral lines and pale patches of lichen beneath the snow. The crevice was easy to miss from below. From the cabin clearing, it would have looked like another shadow between stones. Up close, it revealed itself as a narrow opening, just wide enough for a man to turn his shoulders and pass through. Coda glanced back once, not pleading, not excited, waiting. Ethan crouched beside him and rested a gloved hand briefly on the dog's harness. The black fabric was cold beneath his palm, the deep red trim dusted with snow. "You done chasing rabbits?" he murmured. Coda looked into the crevice again. Ethan followed his gaze. The wind moved behind them through the pines, dragging loose snow over the rocks in long, thin ribbons. It came down the slope with the same steady persistence that had worried the cabin walls all night. Ethan felt it at his back, pressing against the fabric of his old military gray tactical shirt, finding the edge of his dark red thermal collar, touching the skin beneath his jaw. Then he leaned closer to the crevice. The pressure changed, not enough for a careless man to notice, enough for Ethan. He turned slightly and stepped into the opening. The stone closed around him. The first sensation was not warmth, it was absence. The wind did not vanish. He could still hear it outside, moving over the snow, scraping through pine needles, brushing against the high rocks. But inside the crevice, it lost its shape. The force that had pushed against his back a moment before seemed to break apart against the stone, splitting, folding, arriving as weak eddies rather than one clean attack. Ethan stood still. He had learned in places far from Montana that the smallest environmental detail could decide whether a man walked out or became part of the ground. Heat shimmer on a road. Dust moving the wrong direction. A door hanging too still. Air was never empty. It carried intention, danger, memory. Here the air carried something different. Interruption. The crevice did not run straight back into the ridge. After a few feet, the right wall angled inward, forcing the narrow passage to bend slightly before widening into a shallow pocket. The pocket was not large. It could hold 2 men standing, maybe 3 if none of them cared about comfort. A few dry pine needles had collected along one side, but they lay in a strange pattern. They had not been driven deep by wind. They had settled as if the force bringing them in had lost interest halfway through. Coda stepped in behind him. The dog's posture changed at once. At the mouth of the crevice, his ears had been sharp and active. Inside the pocket, his shoulders lowered. His jaw loosened. He did not lie down, but the guarded tension left his body in degrees, like a bowstring eased by careful hands. Ethan noticed that too. He always noticed Coda. There had been nights when the dog's stillness had meant more than any instrument, when a low head or angled ear had warned Ethan that something human eyes had missed was already moving. Coda was not magic. Ethan would have distrusted magic. Coda was better than that. He was honest. His body reported the world without pride. Ethan removed one glove and held his bare hand at chest level. Cold. Yes, but not the same cold. Outside, the wind had teeth. In here, it had memory of teeth. He stepped back toward the entrance and extended his hand past the rock edge. The pressure struck his knuckles instantly. He pulled his hand inside again. The difference was small and enormous at once. A strange feeling moved through him. Not joy. Not yet. Something closer to embarrassment. He had spent the night thinking about how to strengthen the cabin. Door seams, wall joints, roof patches, stove draw. He had been looking for weaknesses in the structure because that was what men like him did. Identify the problem. Reinforce. Correct. Endure. But the forest, with a rabbit and a dog and a crack in old stone, had just offered another question. What if the problem was not how weak the cabin was? What if the problem was where it stood? Ethan turned back toward the entrance. Through the opening, he could see part of the slope below. Black pines, white snow, the faint shape of the cabin roof beyond the trees. From this angle, the cabin looked exposed in a way it had not before. It stood in the clearing like a proud little argument, square to the very force that wanted to take it apart. The repairs he had planned now seemed like polishing a shield while standing in the path of a cannon. Coda moved deeper into the pocket and placed one paw on a flat stone. Then he looked at Ethan. It was only a dog's look. And yet, for 1 second, Ethan felt the odd weight of being judged by something older than speech. Not accused, not mocked, simply shown. A thin ribbon of loose snow skated past the crevice mouth, driven hard by the slope wind. Ethan watched it rush toward the opening, certain it would shoot straight through. Instead, the snow curled. It twisted sideways, broke apart into powder, and dropped softly near Coda's paws. The dog lowered his nose to it, sniffed once, then looked up at Ethan as if the mountain had just spoken in a language only the two of them had bothered to hear. Ethan did not move for a long moment. The forest outside kept breathing. The ridge held its silence. Somewhere under the rocks, the hare had escaped into whatever small kingdom belonged to hares and other creatures wise enough to choose narrow doors. Finally, Ethan crouched and studied the lower edge of the crevice. The ground was uneven, but not unstable. Old stone, packed dirt, wind-scoured snow. No fresh rockfall marked the entrance. No heavy ice hung above. There were cracks in the granite, but not the kind that promised immediate betrayal. Still, he did not let the thought run too far. A place that sheltered from wind could kill a man another way if he mistook advantage for permission. He had survived too long to romanticize terrain. He moved carefully, checking the sidewalls with his eyes, then his hands. The stone was cold enough to sting his palm. He looked upward. The crevice opened to a slice of pale sky, partly shielded by leaning rock and pine branches. Snow had gathered along one ledge, but not enough to threaten collapse. Deeper in, the pocket narrowed again into a dark seam no man could pass through. Not a cave, not a home. But something. Coda sniffed along the edge where rock met ground. He sneezed once, shook snow from his muzzle, and stepped back to Ethan's side. The simple, ordinary motion made Ethan almost smile. A dog had chased a rabbit. That was all. A rabbit had chosen stone. That was all. A man had followed because loneliness made him more willing to trust the only creature that still expected him to return. That was not destiny in the way stories liked to dress it up, but it was close enough. Ethan stayed in the crevice until his fingers began to ache from the cold. He listened to the wind outside and the reduced version of it within. He stepped in and out several times, measuring the difference with his body. At the entrance, the air struck. 2 steps in, it scattered. In the shallow pocket, it weakened enough that a small flame might survive if shielded well. Heat might hold there longer. A wall might not have to fight the full storm. A roof might not take the same punishment. Might. That word mattered. Might was not certainty. Might was not safety. Might was a door cracked open in a place that had offered few doors. At last, Ethan turned back downhill. Coda followed without resistance now, the chase forgotten. The dog trotted at Ethan's left, occasionally lowering his nose to the snow where the hare's trail cut away between rocks, but he did not pursue it again. His work, whatever instinct had started it, seemed finished. They reached the edge of the clearing just as the sun rose higher above the pines. The cabin waited below. In daylight, with smoke beginning to thin from its chimney, it looked almost decent. A tired little building, yes, but repairable. A man could convince himself of many things looking at it from a distance. He could convince himself that enough nails, enough wedges, enough stubbornness would make it ready. Ethan stood where the tree line opened and studied it. He saw the patch roof, the door he had planned to square, the north wall that caught the descending wind too cleanly, the open ground around it, bare and exposed, offering the storm a straight path. He saw the work ahead if he stayed with the original plan. Then he turned his head and looked back toward the ridge. The crevice was hidden again from this angle. A secret returned to stone. Coda sat beside him in the snow. His amber eyes remained fixed on the cabin, then shifted briefly to Ethan's face. The dog did not understand building permits, budgets, preserve regulations, or the special human talent for defending a bad idea because hands had already bled for it. But he understood exposure. He understood pressure. He understood that the clearing is not rest. Ethan exhaled slowly, watching his breath drift and flatten in the cold. He had fixed broken things before: weapons, engines, shelters, men, when there had still been enough left in them to carry. But some things did not need repair. They needed relocation. They needed humility. They needed a man to admit that effort alone did not make a decision wise. The cabin was not weak because it was old. It was weak because it was standing in the wrong place. Ethan looked down at Coda. "You found something?" he said quietly. Coda blinked once, solemn as a priest pretending not to want bacon. That nearly drew the smile out of him. Nearly. Ethan started toward the cabin, but his mind was no longer inside its walls. Each step back across the clearing felt different now. The snow sounded the same under his boots. The trees stood in the same places. The smoke lifted from the chimney in the same thin line before the wind bent it hard east. But the world had changed because he had learned how to see one part of it differently. At the porch, he paused and looked back one more time. The ridge gave nothing away. The forest kept its own counsel. Inside the cabin, the stove waited. The tools waited. The list of repairs waited. Ethan stepped through the low doorway and stood in the dim room, listening to the familiar tick of old wood shifting in cold air. Last night, that sound had been a problem to solve. Now it sounded like a warning he had finally understood. He rested one hand on the doorframe, feeling the draft touch his wrist where cloth and skin met. No anger came. Only clarity. The cabin had done what it could. It simply could not do what the winter would ask. By late morning, Ethan Hale had stopped trying to convince the cabin to be something it was not. He did not tear it apart. Not yet. A rash man destroyed before understanding. Ethan had survived too many narrow places to confuse urgency with wisdom. He walked through the cabin once more, touching the doorframe, the north wall, the patched roof seam, the stovepipe. Each piece had a problem he could name. Each problem had a repair he could imagine. That was what made it dangerous. A repairable thing could seduce a man into staying with a bad decision. Coda stood near the open door, his cream-gray coat catching the pale light, amber eyes fixed on Ethan with that patient judgment only dogs and old mountains seemed allowed to possess. The German shepherd did not wag. He did not whine. He simply waited. Harness black against his shoulders, dark red trim bright as a small ember against the winter colors. Ethan took the laminated emergency card from the table, copied the preserve radio channels into his pocket notebook, then folded the old site map Ray Caldwell had given him. He added a short list beneath it. Nails, brackets, rope, tar paper, weather cloth, lantern oil, stove gasket, heavier hinges. Then, after a long pause, he added one more word. Timber. He looked at it. The word sat there like a dare. Outside, the wind moved along the clearing and pressed a thin white spray of snow against the cabin wall. The place answered with a tired tick of old wood. "All right," Ethan said quietly. Coda stepped onto the porch before him. The drive into Northridge took 40 minutes, though the distance was not great. The road descended through pine forest, crossed a frozen creek, then followed a pale ridge where the land opened into a small valley. Northridge appeared slowly. A cluster of timber buildings, a church with a white steeple, a gas pump under a rusted awning, a general store, a post office, a sheriff's annex, and a lumberyard pressed against the far edge of town like it wanted to leave, but had too many debts. Smoke rose from chimneys and bent east almost immediately. Ethan noticed that too. Northridge was not poor exactly, but it was weathered. The kind of town that had patched itself so many times, the patches became history. Trucks carried dents like family names. Porches leaned but did not fall. People moved with the narrowed shoulders of those who expected cold to enter any unguarded space. Coda sat upright in the passenger seat as Ethan parked outside Keen's general store. The store had a wide front window filled with practical things: wool socks, lanterns, canned beans, dog biscuits, snow shovels, ammunition boxes, coffee tins. A bell rang above the door when Ethan entered. Heat from a black iron stove rolled over him at once, carrying the smell of coffee, dried leather, flour sacks, old wood, and the faint sweetness of peppermint candies kept in a glass jar near the counter. 3 men stood near the stove, each holding a mug as if it were a legal document. A woman in a blue knit hat compared jars of jam near the back shelf. Behind the counter stood Martha Keene. She was around 65, maybe older, though age in places like Northridge did not always show by years. Sometimes it showed by how many winters had argued with a face and failed to win completely. Martha was short and broad, with strong hands, silver hair pinned into a tight bun, and pale blue eyes sharp enough to trim loose threads from across a room. Her cheeks had a permanent pinkness from stove heat and cold air. She wore a thick dark green cardigan over a plaid dress, and she carried herself like someone who had been obeyed for so long that even silence seemed to stand straighter near her. Her mouth curved when she saw Ethan, not welcoming, interested. "You're the new preserve man," she said. "Ethan Hale." I know. Ray called ahead. She looked past him toward the window, where Coda waited in the truck. That your dog? Coda. Looks smarter than most men who take that post. One of the men near the stove chuckled. Ethan did not react. I need supplies. Supplies we have, Martha said. Common sense costs extra, and we're nearly out. The men laughed again, not cruelly, but easily. They had the rhythm of people who had practiced laughing together for years. Ethan gave her the list. Martha put on half-moon glasses and read it slowly. Her eyebrows lifted at timber, then at brackets, then at rope. This is more than patchwork. That's right. You planning to rebuild that cabin? No. The store quieted a little, the way rooms do when gossip smells fresh. Martha lowered the list. Then what exactly are you planning? Ethan could have lied. He could have said he wanted reinforcement, emergency storage, animal fencing. Men lied for comfort more often than for malice. But comfort was expensive in cold country. I found a windbreak in the rock north of the cabin, he said. Natural crevice. The wind breaks inside it. I'm looking at putting a storm shelter there. For half a second, no one moved. Then one of the men near the stove coughed into his coffee. Martha stared at Ethan over the rim of her glasses. A storm shelter, she repeated. In the rock. In the rock, she said again, and this time the words were not a question. They were a display item, something held up so everyone could examine its foolishness. The man closest to the stove was heavy-set, with a red nose and a beard yellowed slightly around the mouth from pipe smoke. He smiled into his mug. Cave living. That's new. Not a cave, Ethan said. Martha leaned both hands on the counter. Son, houses are built out where air can move, not stuffed into cracks like a frightened fox. Coda shifted outside in the truck, visible through the frosted glass. His ears lifted, as if even separated by wood and window, he had detected the shape of the conversation. Ethan said nothing. Martha took his silence as permission to continue. We've had men come through here with ideas before. Solar sheds, wind walls. One fellow tried to heat a barn with compost and nearly cooked the floorboards black. Winter makes fools of clever people first. I'm not trying to be clever. That may be the problem. Her voice remained dry, but something hard lived underneath it. You're a soldier, aren't you? Was? Then you know tools have purposes. A house is a house. A crack in a rock is where animals hide when something bigger is chasing them. A few people laughed. Someone said, maybe the dog picked the house. More laughter. Ethan felt no anger. Anger required surprise, and he had none. People feared what they could not measure. Then they mocked it so fear did not have to show its face. He took the list back from the counter and folded it once. I'll still need the supplies. Martha watched him. You'll pay cash? Yes. Then I'll sell you rope for your rock house. Her mouth tightened. But don't expect the mountain to apologize when it teaches you manners. The words had weight, more than the jokes. Ethan heard something behind them that was not simple ridicule. A grief hardened into policy, maybe. A memory wearing armor. He had seen that in veterans, widows, officers, mothers. Pain often disguised itself as certainty, because certainty looked better in public. Ethan looked at the men near the stove, then back at Martha. I'm also leaving my emergency contact, he said. That changed the room again, just slightly. Martha blinked. Your what? My phone number. Preserve radio frequency. If the weather turns bad and anyone near the North Road needs help, call in. The heavy-set man grinned. From the rock house? If that's where I am? Martha gave a short, disbelieving laugh. Well, if your little shelter gets too cold, you call us. My store has walls that don't need a geology lesson. I appreciate it. That seemed to annoy her more than an argument would have. Ethan wrote his number and the radio channel on a scrap of brown packing paper. His handwriting was small, square, disciplined. Martha took the paper between 2 fingers, as if it might leave foolishness on her skin. Then, after a pause, she slid it under the edge of the cash box. "I'll keep it," she said, "for entertainment." As Ethan turned to leave, Coda let out one low bark from the truck. Not sharp, not loud. One sound, deep enough to cut through the store window and stop the laughter before it finished. Everyone looked. Outside, the dog was not looking at the door. He was staring across the street toward the lumber yard, where an old man stood half-hidden beneath the workshop awning, motionless in the falling light, his face pale and stricken, not amused, not doubtful, but as if Ethan had just spoken aloud a dream the old man had buried years ago and forgotten to mourn. Ethan followed Coda's gaze. The old man did not wave. He only turned and disappeared into the lumber yard. Ethan paid for what Martha had ready: oil, nails, cloth, 2 coils of rope, and loaded them into the truck. Coda watched him with solemn attention, then glanced again toward the lumber yard. "I saw him," Ethan said. Coda sneezed once, which Ethan chose not to interpret. The lumber yard belonged to Rourke Timber and Repair, according to a weather-beaten sign nailed crooked above the gate. Inside the yard, stacked boards sat under tarps weighted with stones. Sawdust froze in pale drifts near the workshop door. A half-built cabinet leaned against one wall, its joints so cleanly cut that Ethan paused despite himself. A man stepped out from the workshop, wiping his hands on a cloth. Mason Rourke looked nearly 70, tall but bent slightly through the shoulders, as if years of leaning over wood had taught his spine a new loyalty. His hair was white and thin, combed back without much success. A short white beard covered his jaw, trimmed unevenly by hands that cared more about tools than mirrors. His face was narrow, deeply lined, with gray eyes that seemed mild until they settled on something structural. Then they sharpened like chisels. His hands were large, knuckled, and scarred, the fingers slightly crooked from old breaks and weather. He had the careful manner of a man who had spent his life making things fit and never quite managed to make himself fit anywhere. "You're Hale," Mason said. "Yes, Mason Rourke." They shook hands. Mason's grip was dry and strong, though Ethan felt a faint tremor in it. "You heard in the store," Ethan said. "I heard Martha perform in the store," Mason replied. "Hearing and enduring aren't the same craft." Ethan almost smiled. Mason looked toward the truck. Coda sat with his head out the open window, amber eyes fixed on the old carpenter. "Good dog," Mason said. "He knows. Most good dogs do." Mason turned and motioned Ethan inside. "Show me what you need." The workshop smelled of cedar shavings, iron, boiled coffee, and linseed oil. Tools hung in careful rows along the walls: planes, chisels, hand saws, braces, squares, clamps. On a large table near the back lay several rolled papers, weighted with a mug and a block plane. One of them had been partly unrolled, showing a pencil drawing of a low structure pressed against a rock face. Ethan saw it before Mason could cover it. The old man noticed. For a moment, the room filled with the small awkwardness of exposed longing. "That old thing," Mason said. "It looks like a shelter." "Looked," Mason corrected. "Long time ago." Ethan waited. Mason rubbed his thumb along the edge of the work cloth in his hand. His eyes moved toward the window, where the general store stood across the street. "I spent years reading about mountain houses, old trappers, mining camps, Scandinavian sod roofs, stone windbreaks, places built by people who couldn't afford to be proud. They used earth, Rock, slope, tree lines made the weather go around them instead of through them. He gave a quiet laugh, but it contained no humor. I drew plans once. Thought Northridge ought to have a proper storm refuge built into the ridge. Low roof, double entry, stone back wall. Wind turned before it touched the door. He looked down at his hands. People called it a cave, a root cellar for cowards. Martha called it my badger palace. She has a way with words. She has a way with fear. Mason's voice softened just a fraction. Most do. Ethan looked at the drawing again. Why didn't you build it? Mason's face changed. It did not collapse. It did something worse. It stayed almost exactly the same while the life behind it dimmed. Because I listened too long, he said. Not to the wind, to people. A man can survive ridicule once or twice, but when it comes every time he opens his mouth, he starts trimming his own thoughts before they reach daylight. He folded the cloth carefully. After a while, he calls it maturity. It's usually surrender wearing better boots. Ethan felt the word settle somewhere deep. Outside, a truck passed slowly, chains clinking on its tires. The sound faded. Mason straightened with effort and tapped Ethan's list. If you're building into stone, standard cuts won't save you. You'll need short lengths first, easier to fit. Don't trust the rock to be straight just because it looks solid. Rock lies less than wood, but it still lies. I haven't gotten approval to build. Then don't call it building yet. Call it measuring. Mason's eyes sharpened. And if Ray Caldwell complains, tell him the old cabin is a liability with a stovepipe. Ethan looked at him. Mason shrugged. It is. They spent the next hour pulling materials. Not enough to build a shelter, only enough to begin understanding one. Mason chose boards by touch as much as sight. He rejected pieces Ethan would have accepted, then explained why. Hidden twist, old split, grain running wrong near a knot. He added wedges, a carpenter's square, and a bundle of thin pine strips for templating uneven stone. These bend, he said. Rock won't. Pride won't either, but at least pine is useful. By the time Ethan loaded the truck, the sky had lowered. Afternoon light turned the snow blue in the spaces between buildings. Martha watched from the general store window, arms crossed. When Ethan glanced over, she lifted one hand and gave him a tiny wave that somehow managed to insult and bless him at the same time. Mason saw it. She'll laugh until she can't, he said. That's supposed to comfort me? No. Mason looked toward the mountains beyond town. It's supposed to remind you laughter isn't always truth. Sometimes it's just noise people make, so they don't have to hear themselves being afraid. Ethan tightened the last rope over the load. Mason stood beside him, coat collar lifted against the wind. Up close, the old carpenter looked frailer than he had in the workshop. The cold found his joints. His hands trembled once before he tucked them into his pockets. You don't have to help, Ethan said. Mason looked at the truck bed, then at Coda, then toward the north ridge where the preserve lay hidden among pines. Yes, he said quietly. I think I do. Ethan did not ask why. He already knew enough. Some men needed redemption from things they had done. Others needed redemption from things they had never dared to begin. Ethan climbed into the truck. Coda shifted closer, his harness brushing the seat. As they pulled away from Northridge, the town shrank in the rearview mirror. The store, the stove-warm laughter, Martha's sharp eyes, Mason's hidden drawing. Smoke bent hard by the wind above every roof. Ethan drove back toward the preserve with the supplies rattling behind him. The idea no longer belonged only to him. That made it heavier, and somehow more possible. Ethan did not begin by building. He began by doubting. That was the part most men in Northridge would not have guessed. They might have imagined him marching back from town with timber and rope, pride burning hot enough to keep the cold from reaching him, ready to prove Martha Keene wrong by hammer and stubbornness. They would have been disappointed. Ethan Hale had survived too long to treat confidence like a tool. Confidence was useful only after it had been beaten against facts. So for 3 days, he studied the crevice. Each morning, he left the old cabin before sunrise with Coda at his side and a pack over one shoulder. The forest would still be blue with dawn, the pines standing black against the pale snow, and the air so cold it made the inside of his nose sting. His boots followed the same path north through the clearing, past the deadfall where the hare had first broken cover, up the slope toward the granite. Coda always reached the stones first. The German shepherd no longer searched for the rabbit. That brief wild chase had become only a doorway into something larger. Now he moved with workmanlike calm, head low, ears shifting to the forest, then to the wind, then to Ethan's steps behind him. His cream-gray coat carried flecks of snow along the shoulders, and the black harness with dark red trim stood out against the winter like a mark of purpose. At the mouth of the crevice, the dog would stop. Every time. Not because he was afraid. Ethan knew fear in a dog. He had seen it in trembling legs, wide eyes, frantic licking. Coda showed none of that. He stopped the way a seasoned guide stopped at a river crossing, not refusing the path, but reminding the man behind him that water had opinions too. Ethan checked everything. Fresh rockfall first. He walked the base of the granite walls, looking for newly broken edges, pale scars in the stone, snow disturbed by falling pieces. There were old fragments, yes, but nothing recent enough to suggest the ridge was shedding itself in weather. He looked up at the ledges where snow had gathered. Some pockets sat above the entrance, but the main overhang did not carry a dangerous load. Still, he marked 2 places in his notebook where melt and freeze might change the risk later. He checked drainage next. With a folding trench tool, he scraped through snow and frozen topsoil near the entrance. The ground beneath was firm, a mix of packed dirt, gravel, and stone. No sheet of hidden ice, no water channel cutting straight through the pocket. Farther inside, the floor sloped slightly toward one side, enough that any melt could be guided away if he laid the base correctly. He checked air last. That took the longest. Mason Rourke had given him thin strips of cloth, light enough to tremble under the faintest breath. Ethan tied them to twigs, to nails, to a cord stretched from one rock edge to another. He watched them in the morning, noon, and late afternoon. Outside the crevice, the cloth snapped cleanly in the descending wind. At the entrance, it fluttered in broken bursts. A few steps inside, the movement became confused, uncertain. In the deeper pocket, some strips barely stirred at all. The stone was not stopping the wind. It was humiliating it. That distinction mattered. On the second day, Ethan radioed Ray Caldwell. The preserve manager answered after a burst of static. His voice came through flat and irritated, the voice of a man interrupted by paperwork or bad coffee. Caldwell: Hale, I need approval to decommission unsafe sections of the old cabin and repurpose materials for an emergency shelter. There was a silence long enough for Ethan to hear wind scratching along the rock. Say that again, Ray said. Ethan did. This time, Ray swore softly away from the microphone. You want to take apart the cabin? Not all of it immediately. Unsafe exterior additions first. I'll document with photographs. The structure isn't winter capable in its current location. It's the assigned winter post. It's a summer cabin with a stove. Another silence. Ethan waited. He could imagine Ray in his office, thick fingers pressed against his forehead, seeing budgets, liability forms, and the shape of a headache. "Where's this shelter going?" "Rock crevice north of the clearing, inside the preserve boundary. Natural windbreak. It should function as a storm pocket shelter." "I don't like the word should." "Neither do I. That's why I'm testing before building." Ray sighed. It crackled through the speaker like paper tearing. "You understand, this is not a personal residence." "Yes?" "It's an emergency structure, temporary unless inspected." "Yes?" "You hurt yourself. I'm not telling the board I approved some mountain man experiment because you sounded calm on the radio. You can tell them the existing cabin presented a safety concern." "That's worse. They hate safety concerns. They cost money." Despite himself, Ethan almost smiled. Finally, Ray said, "Document everything. Touch only what's unsafe or already compromised. Use salvage where possible. Do not block access. Keep a secondary exit if there is one." "There is? And hail?" "Yes. If this turns stupid, stop before it turns tragic." Ethan looked into the crevice where Coda stood watching a cloth strip tremble at the entrance. That's the plan. Approval was not blessing, but it was enough. Mason arrived the next morning with a sled of tools and the expression of a man trying not to look too eager. The old carpenter wore a heavy wool coat, patched at one elbow, a brown cap pulled low, and fingerless gloves under thicker mittens he removed whenever he needed to feel the wood. In the forest, away from town and Martha's store window, he seemed both older and younger. Older in the body, his back stiffer, his breath visible in short bursts, his knees careful on uneven snow. Younger in the eyes, gray, alert, bright with the half-buried flame of a thought allowed into daylight again. He stood at the mouth of the crevice for a long time. "Not bad," he said. From Mason, Ethan understood. This was close to poetry. They began with measurements, or what passed for measurements in a place that mocked straight lines. Mason taught him to make templates from the thin pine strips. Press the strip against the stone. Mark where the rock bulged. Trim. Press again. Do not force wood to argue with granite. Granite had more time. "The trick," Mason said, running one crooked finger along the right wall, "is not to build a wall and hope the stone forgives it. The trick is to let the stone tell you what shape the wall was always supposed to be." Ethan listened. That was easy for him. Easier than speaking. In the military, he had learned from men who could explain a breach point with one glance and a hand sign. Mason explained in touch, in pauses, in small grunts of disapproval when a board did not sit true. They did not build a house. They began a negotiation. The first frame section took half a day and looked embarrassingly small when finished. 2 posts, 1 crossbeam, 3 shaped wedges, and a lower sill that had been shaved so many times Ethan could feel the work in his shoulders. He carried each piece in, set it, marked it, carried it out, cut it, carried it back. Again and again. The stone allowed nothing casual. Coda watched from just outside the entrance. At first, Ethan thought the dog simply preferred staying clear of swinging tools. But twice, when Ethan moved a post into place, Coda rose and refused to cross the threshold. His ears angled toward the left edge of the frame. His nose lifted. Ethan paused both times. The first time, he felt nothing. The second time, he removed one glove and held his hand near the seam. A faint line of cold touched his skin. Not enough to move cloth. Enough for the dog. Mason saw him lower the post. "What?" "Draft." Mason came over, placed the back of his hand near the seam, and waited. For a moment, his face said he felt nothing. Then the wind outside shifted, and the small current slid inward like a secret. The old man's eyebrows lifted. "Well," he said, looking down at Coda, "that one's on payroll now." Coda blinked solemnly. "He works for biscuits," Ethan said. "Cheaper than most consultants." By late afternoon, the first partial wall stood inside the crevice mouth, not closing it entirely, but shaping the entrance so the broken wind had less room to gather itself again. It was rough to look at, built of salvaged timber and fresh-cut support, but the joints sat tight against the rock. Ethan tied a cloth strip near the inside edge and watched. Outside, the wind came hard down the slope. At the entrance, snow dust snapped sideways. Inside, the strip barely moved. For the first time since arriving in Montana, Ethan felt satisfaction rise in him before he could restrain it. It was small, controlled, but real. Not pride exactly. Pride liked audiences. This was quieter. The fierce relief of seeing a decision hold against the world. He looked at Mason. "That's stable." Mason leaned on his measuring stick and studied the cloth. He did not rush to praise. The old man's silence stretched long enough that Ethan felt irritation stir. Then Mason nodded once. "You're doing it right." Ethan let out a slow breath. Mason turned toward the shadowed corner where the rock met the floor. "But right isn't finished." From his coat pocket, Mason took a small tin cup, filled it with water from Ethan's canteen, and set it in the deepest corner of the new shelter frame. Ethan watched him. "The cloth tells you about wind," Mason said, voice low. "Water tells you about heat." Coda stepped forward, sniffed the cup once, then backed away and lay down near the entrance, not in the safe pocket, but between Ethan and the corner, as if guarding them from a danger too quiet to deserve teeth. That night, Ethan slept in the old cabin, though sleep came only in torn pieces. The wind rose after midnight and pressed against the repaired door. He had sealed it better now, driven wedges into the frame, packed cloth along the lower seam. The room was less cruel than before, but no warmer in any honest sense. The stove glowed red. Heat gathered near it, then thinned toward the walls, as if ashamed to travel. Ethan lay on the bunk fully dressed, boots on the floor within reach, and thought of the tin cup. It was a ridiculous thing to think about in the dark. A cup of water in a half-built shelter. Nothing dramatic, nothing heroic. Yet it troubled him more than the laughter in town had. Laughter was easy to dismiss. Water was not. Water had no opinion. It simply told the truth when temperature asked. Before dawn, he rose. Coda was already awake. They climbed to the crevice under a hard blue sky. Frost silvered the rocks. The cloth strip inside the frame hung still. Ethan's first feeling was victory. Then he crouched by the tin cup. A thin skin of ice covered the surface. Not thick, not complete. Enough. Mason arrived half an hour later and found Ethan still crouched there, holding the cup. The old man said nothing at first. He looked at the ice, then at the frame, then at the floor. "Wind didn't get in," Ethan said. "No, but cold did." Mason nodded. "Cold doesn't need to rush. That's why it's harder to respect." Ethan set the cup down. The mistake was not catastrophic. That almost made it more valuable. Catastrophic mistakes taught by killing. Small mistakes taught while a man could still listen. They spent that morning changing the plan. The floor could not sit directly on the stone and frozen ground. They would raise it slightly, leaving a shallow dead-air space beneath, then pack dry earth and gravel where needed to stop ground cold. Just from climbing straight into the living area. Mason suggested flat stones near the stove location to absorb heat and release it slowly. Ethan added the idea of an entry pocket, a crude vestibule, not large, but enough that the door would not open directly into the warm core. 2 doors if we can manage it, Mason said. Not enough hinges. 1 door and 1 hanging barrier then. Canvas. Blanket. Anything that makes the cold knock twice. Ethan liked that. Make the cold knock twice. It was the kind of phrase a man remembered when his fingers were too numb for theory. They returned to the old cabin and began selecting what could be stripped first under Ray's permission. The porch railing was nearly useless but yielded short braces. The sagging outer shed wall came down easily, its boards gray and warped but salvageable in pieces. Ethan photographed each section before removal, noting rot, split grain, failed nails. Not because he enjoyed paperwork, but because Ray had asked for documentation and because legitimacy mattered if this shelter was ever to help anyone beyond him. Mason moved slower than Ethan, but wasted less. He could look at a board and already know its second life. A warped plank became a shelf. A short beam became a brace. An old door frame, once squared and cut down, might become the inner hanging support for the vestibule barrier. He handled discarded wood with something like mercy. "Most things aren't useless," he said once, noticing Ethan watching. "They're just done being what people first wanted." Ethan carried that sentence longer than he expected. By evening, the crevice held more than a frame. It held intention. A raised floor section sat in place near the back pocket. Flat stones were stacked where the stove might eventually stand. The entrance frame had been adjusted again so the left seam no longer whispered cold when Coda passed it. A temporary canvas sheet hung from a crossbar, ugly and stiff. But when Ethan stepped through it, he felt the air hesitate. Not warmth, not shelter. A beginning. Mason stood outside the crevice, looking at the day's work in the dimming light. Snow had begun to fall in fine, dry grains. They caught in his white beard and on the shoulders of his old coat. For a moment, he seemed less like a carpenter than a forgotten prophet of timber and stone, one who had waited too long for anyone to believe the mountain could be read. Ethan came to stand beside him. "You think it will work?" Mason did not answer quickly. "I think," he said at last, "it has earned the right to keep being tested." That was honest. Ethan respected honest more than comfort. Coda walked into the shelter, crossed the raised floor, and turned once before lying down in the shallow pocket behind the frame. His shoulders lowered. His head settled on his paws. His amber eyes stayed open, but the hard alertness had eased from his body. Ethan watched him. The old cabin had never done that to the dog. Not once. The wind moved outside the crevice, brushing snow along the rock face, searching for its old straight path. This time, it did not find one easily. It struck the granite, broke, curled, and weakened before it reached the work of their hands. Ethan felt the cold on his face. He felt the ache in his shoulders. He felt the sting of split skin at one knuckle where the day had opened him. And beneath all of it, he felt something dangerous and necessary. Not certainty. Commitment. The shelter was not ready. The floor needed finishing. The frame needed reinforcement. The old cabin still had to surrender more of itself. Ray would need more reports. Mason would need rest whether he admitted it or not. And Winter, indifferent as any ancient god, would keep walking toward them. But Ethan no longer felt as though he were repairing a mistake. He was building an answer. The warning came over the radio just after sunrise. Ethan was kneeling inside the half-finished storm shelter, tightening a brace near the raised floor, when Ray Caldwell's voice broke through the static. "Hale, you listening?" Ethan reached for the handset where it rested on a flat stone beside his tool roll. Go ahead." There was a pause, and in that pause Ethan heard something he had not heard in Ray before. Care. Not panic. Ray was not built for panic. But the edges of his voice had changed, scraped thinner by information he did not like. National Weather Service upgraded the system. Blizzard warning. High confidence now. Wind gusts could push past 70 miles an hour along the ridge. Wind chill dropping hard. Possible road closures. Possible power loss. Ethan looked toward the mouth of the crevice. Outside, the morning was too beautiful for bad news. Sunlight lay over the snow in clean silver. The pines stood still. A chickadee moved along a branch as if the world had promised to remain gentle. That was how weather liked to lie before it put on its armor. "When?" Ethan asked. "Late tomorrow into the next night. Maybe earlier if the front speeds up." Mason Rourke, who had been shaving a wedge near the entrance, stopped moving. The old carpenter sat back on his heels, one hand pressed against his knee. His white beard was dusted with sawdust, and the cold had reddened the narrow bridge of his nose. He was breathing harder these days, though he hid it badly. The work had pulled something awake in him, but age still collected its due. Ethan watched him absorb the warning. "Copy," Ethan said into the radio. Ray exhaled. "I know you're doing your rock shelter business. I need you to check on the North Road residents if you can. Some of them won't take the alert seriously unless someone stands in front of them." "They'll listen to you?" Ray gave a short, dry sound. "They'll listen to me, and then do what they wanted anyway. But you've got the caretaker badge now. Might scare them into pretending." Ethan glanced at the small metal badge clipped to his coat. It looked almost embarrassed to be there. "I'll go. Keep your radio on." "I will." Static swallowed Ray's goodbye. For a while, the shelter was quiet except for wind moving faintly outside the stone and Coda's slow breathing near the inner frame. The German Shepherd lay in the shallow pocket, paws crossed, amber eyes open. He had begun treating the unfinished place differently than the old cabin. Not as home, not yet, but as ground that could be trusted if watched carefully. Mason stood slowly. "You should go before noon," he said. "You heard Ray?" "I heard the forecast." Mason looked toward the old cabin below, half stripped now, still standing in the clearing like an accusation with a roof. "Warnings make people proud. They hear one and remember all the storms they survived, not the one coming." Ethan packed his tools. "You coming?" Mason gave him a look. "To let Martha Keene sharpen her teeth on me in public? I'm old, not bored." Ethan almost smiled. Then Mason reached into his coat and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. On it, to do some cement, he had drawn quick, practical sketches, a doorway with a hanging blanket behind it, a stack of snow pressed into a windbreak, boards angled against a shed wall, a porch corner reinforced against uplift. "Show them this," Mason said. "Pictures beat speeches when people have already decided not to hear you." Ethan took the paper. Mason's fingers lingered a moment before letting go. "There's no shame in trying, even if they laugh," the old man said, voice lower now. "The shame is letting their laughter do the deciding." Ethan folded the page carefully and placed it inside his jacket. Coda rose before Ethan called him. The drive into Northridge felt different this time. Not because the road had changed. The same frozen creek, the same dark pines, the same ridge where smoke from distant chimneys bent east. But Ethan carried the forecast with him, and a forecast like that had weight. It sat beside him like a silent passenger, heavier than Coda, colder than the windshield. The town was already awake and pretending not to be worried. A man shoveled the same patch of sidewalk twice outside the post office. 2 teenagers loaded firewood into the back of a pickup with the lazy urgency of people whose parents had ordered them outside. The church bell rope slapped faintly against the white steeple in a small, restless breeze. Martha Keene's general store glowed with heat behind its front windows. Inside, the black stove burned hard. People had gathered around it with coffee, lists, and opinions. Bad weather made the store into a courtroom where everyone served as both judge and witness. Martha stood behind the counter, silver hair pinned tighter than before, her dark green cardigan buttoned to the throat. She looked up as Ethan entered, and her mouth formed a smile that had no warmth in it. "Well," she said, "the man from the rock returns." A few people turned. Coda stepped in beside Ethan, snow melting on his cream-gray coat. The dog stood calmly, harness dark against his shoulders, eyes moving from face to face. He did not ask permission from the room. He simply occupied it. Ethan removed his gloves. "Blizzard warning's been upgraded," he said. "Gusts could reach 70. Wind chill dangerous. Ray asked me to check the North Road and anyone exposed." Martha leaned both hands on the counter. "Ray asked you, did he?" "Yes." "Ray asks a lot when the budget won't answer." That earned a few murmurs. Ethan unfolded Mason's paper and set it on the counter. "These are quick protections. Reduce direct wind on doors. Create a buffer inside entryways. Reinforce weak shed corners. Move livestock away from north-facing walls if you can. Keep one interior room warm, instead of trying to heat the whole house if power drops." A younger man near the stove stepped closer. He was maybe 30, lean, with sandy hair under a wool cap, and the nervous hands of someone who worked more hours than he slept. Ethan recognized him vaguely from the lumber yard. His name was Jonah Bell, a mechanic who fixed snowmobiles, generators, and anything with a motor if paid in cash or venison. His face still had youth in it, but worry had already started carving lines around his mouth. "My back shed faces north," Jonah said. "Roof lifted some last year. What would you use?" Ethan pointed to one of Mason's sketches. "Angled bracing from the lower wall to the ground if you have boards. Don't give wind a clean edge to pry under. Stack snow against the base if it packs." Jonah nodded. Serious. Behind him, Martha made a sound. "Now we're taking orders from a man who's been here less than a week." Ethan looked at her. Not orders. What then? Options. Options wrapped in fear. The room shifted. People liked Martha, or they were used to her. In small towns, the difference could become a tradition. A broad-shouldered rancher named Cole Drayton laughed softly. He had a thick black beard, a sunburned face even in winter, and the confident belly of a man whose house, barn, and opinions had all been standing for years. He wore a sheepskin coat and held his coffee near his chest like a shield. "My place has stood 23 winters," Cole said. "If it needed a blanket behind the door, I figure it would have asked by now." More laughter. Ethan did not answer immediately. He looked at Cole's boots, still wet from outside. He looked at the way steam from his cup leaned when the store door opened and closed. He looked at Martha's face and saw the tightness beneath the performance. It was there again, that old guarded fear wearing sarcasm like a crown. "I'm not saying your house is weak," Ethan said. "I'm saying this storm may not care how long it's been standing." Martha's eyes flashed. "Storms never care. That doesn't mean we crawl into holes every time clouds gather." Coda moved then, not dramatically. He left Ethan's side and crossed to the front window. His ears lifted. His nose pointed toward the street. Outside, a sudden gust came down between the buildings, carrying a swirl of dry snow along the road. It struck the side of the general store, then curled hard under the gap beneath the door. The flame in one of Martha's oil lamps flickered. Coda lowered his head toward the door seam. Ethan saw it. So did Jonah. Martha saw it too, and for one small second her expression changed. Not fear. Recognition. Then she closed it away. "Dogs don't run my store," she said. "No," Ethan replied. "But they notice drafts." A faint, high whistle slipped through the lower corner of the store door. It was thin enough that most people would have missed it under the stove crackle and coffee talk. Coda did not. He placed one paw beside the threshold and stared down at the gap. Martha followed his gaze. The whistle rose again, soft and eerie, like a child trying to hum through cold lips. For a heartbeat, nobody laughed. Then Cole Drayton cleared his throat too loudly and said, "Well, if your cave gets lonely, Hale, come sleep in my barn. It's got 4 walls and no rabbits." The room laughed because laughter was easier than listening to a door admit weakness. Martha took Mason's paper and slid it back across the counter. "We appreciate your concern," she said in the tone people used when appreciation had been declared dead. "But this town has handled winter before you and your dog came to teach it manners." Ethan folded the paper. Jonah reached for it before he could put it away. "Can I copy that brace drawing?" Ethan handed it to him. That small act changed something in the room. Not enough to win. Enough to divide the silence. An older woman near the flour sacks asked quietly about covering cellar windows. A man with a limp wanted to know if he should move his generator away from the west wall. Someone else asked about livestock water if power failed. Martha watched all of this with narrowed eyes. She did not stop them, but she did not join them either. For the next 2 hours, Ethan moved through Northridge and the North Road houses. He did not give speeches. He pointed at weak places, porch roofs with uplift edges, doors facing open fields, gaps under shed walls, firewood stacked too far from the house, chimneys with caps loose enough to become missiles. He helped Jonah brace the back shed. He showed an elderly couple how to turn one interior room into a heat core with blankets over doorways and water stored near the stove. He told a young mother to keep boots and outerwear inside the sleeping room in case they had to move at night. Some listened carefully. Some nodded to be polite, and changed nothing. Some took the warning halfway, which was better than not at all. By mid-afternoon, he had worked his way back toward the general store. Martha stood outside now, directing a boy to carry flour sacks from the delivery porch into the side room. Beside her was a little girl of about 8, small and round-faced, with dark curls escaping from a red knit hat. She wore a purple coat too bright for the weather and held a wooden toy horse in one mittened hand. Her eyes were large and curious, moving from Coda to Ethan and back again. Martha saw him notice. "My granddaughter, Nora," she said, as if daring him to make the child part of the conversation. Nora smiled at Coda. "Does he bite?" "Only biscuits," Ethan said. The girl giggled. Martha's face softened before she remembered to harden it. That softness told Ethan more than any confession could have. Martha Keene might mock the world with both hands on the counter, but here was the small kingdom she would burn it down to protect. Nora stepped closer to Coda. "Can I pet him?" Ethan looked at Coda. The dog sat, calm as a carved guardian. Yes, under the chin first. Nora obeyed carefully. Coda lowered his head with solemn dignity, accepting the attention like a king tolerating tribute from a very small ambassador. Martha watched, arms crossed. For a moment, the sharp lines around her mouth loosened. Then the wind moved down the street again, stronger this time, and a loose sign over the feed office banged hard against its bracket. Nora flinched. Martha pulled her close. Ethan kept his voice even. "You have my number." Martha's eyes came back to him. "I have it." "And the radio frequency?" "In the cash box. If things get bad—" "They won't. If they do," Ethan continued, "call before you wait too long." Martha stared at him. The little girl leaned against her coat, one mitten still smelling faintly of dog fur and snow. For the first time, Martha did not answer with a joke. But she did not agree either. Ethan left her there. The road back to the preserve was already gathering wind. Snow blew low over the surface in thin snakes. The sky to the northwest had turned a darker gray, not storm black yet, but dense, metallic, gathering itself behind the mountains. Ethan drove without rushing. Supplies rattled in the bed. Coda rested beside him, eyes half closed, but ears active. At the preserve, Mason was still at the crevice. The old man had reinforced the inner brace, stacked flat stones near the stove base, and hung a heavier canvas panel from the entry bar. He looked exhausted and pleased and irritated by both facts. "How'd they take it?" Mason asked. "Some listened." "Which means most didn't." "Yes." Mason nodded as if that had been the only possible report. "Martha?" Ethan pulled off his gloves. "Still Martha. That woman could argue with Thunder and accuse it of poor timing." Ethan looked toward the sky. "Thunder might lose." Mason gave a short laugh, then coughed into one hand. They worked until dark. There was no wasted motion now. Ethan stacked water containers in the inner pocket. Mason adjusted the canvas barrier so it overlapped the frame instead of hanging straight. Ethan carried in split wood and counted it twice. He checked the emergency radio, spare batteries, lanterns, first aid kit, rope, flare gun, wool blankets, repair cloth, wedges, nails, hammer, saw. Not enough for comfort. Enough for a chance. Coda moved between the shelter and the entrance repeatedly, testing the air with his body. Once he stopped by the lower right seam and stared. Ethan checked it and found a narrow gap where the wood had shrunk slightly in the cold. He packed it with cloth and resin, then drove a wedge tight. The dog moved on. By nightfall, the old cabin sat dark below, no longer the center of Ethan's attention. It looked abandoned already, though parts of it still stood. He felt no guilt now when he looked at it. The cabin had tried. That was all a thing could do. But loyalty to a failed shelter was not virtue. It was sentiment wearing a work coat. Inside the crevice shelter, the space remained small and rough. The raised floor creaked. The stones near the stove were cold still, waiting to be taught heat. The canvas smelled of oil and dust. The walls did not match because the rock did not care for human symmetry, but the wind did not enter cleanly. That mattered more than beauty. Mason packed his tools slowly. "You should sleep here tonight," he said. "I planned to." The old man looked relieved and tried to hide it by tightening a strap too hard. "I'll be back in the morning if the road allows." "Don't come if it's bad." Mason looked at him. "I spent 40 years not coming when I should have. Don't ask me to practice." Ethan accepted that with a nod. After Mason left, Ethan made a small fire in the temporary stove setup, careful, testing the draw. Smoke rose properly. Heat gathered slowly, touching the stones, the floor, the canvas barrier. He did not let himself trust it too soon. Coda lay near the entrance, not fully asleep. Ethan sat on a low crate with his elbows on his knees and listened to the first long breath of the coming storm move through the trees outside. There was fear in him. He did not deny it. Fear was not the enemy. Fear was information. The enemy was pretending fear had no message. He thought of Martha's store, Jonah's borrowed pencil, Nora's mitten on Coda's fur, Cole Drayton's laugh, Mason's shaking hands, Ray's warning over static. He thought of the line between madness and foresight. Often, he suspected, the line was drawn by weather after the fact. Outside, the wind strengthened. Inside, Ethan fed the fire one small piece of wood at a time. Coda lifted his head and looked toward the dark entrance. Ethan followed his gaze. The shelter waited with them, not finished by any standard that comfort would respect, but ready enough to be tested. The storm did not arrive like weather. It arrived like a sentence. By late afternoon, the sky over the northern preserve had lowered until it seemed to rest on the tops of the pines. The mountains disappeared first, swallowed by a gray wall moving in from the northwest. Then the far ridge vanished. Then the trees beyond the clearing became vague black strokes behind sheets of snow. Inside the storm shelter, Ethan Hale listened. He sat near the temporary stove, one forearm resting across his knee, gray-blue eyes fixed on the low entrance where the canvas barrier shifted faintly with each change in pressure. His old military gray tactical shirt was rolled at the wrists despite the cold. The frayed fabric darkened where melted snow had dried. Beneath it, the edge of his dark red thermal collar showed like a small, stubborn flame. His face remained calm, but calm was not the absence of fear. It was fear held in a disciplined hand. Coda stood near the entrance. The German shepherd's cream-gray coat looked almost silver in the firelight. His black harness with deep red trim was still on, because Ethan had not allowed himself the comfort of assuming they would stay inside all night. Coda's ears worked constantly. Left, right, forward. Toward the wind. Toward the rock. Toward the faint sounds no human ear could separate from the storm's endless roar. Outside, the first true blast hit. The sound did not strike the shelter directly. That was the miracle that was not a miracle at all. The wind hit the granite first. It broke against the old stone, split along the angled mouth of the crevice, and arrived at the wooden front wall as something wounded and confused. Still strong, still dangerous, but no longer whole. The frame groaned. The canvas barrier snapped inward once, then settled. Ethan watched the flame in the stove. It bent slightly, then straightened. "Good," he whispered. Coda did not look back. Near the lower right seam, a thin thread of snow dust pushed through where a wedge had shrunk under cold pressure. Coda noticed first. He stepped toward it, lowered his head, and breathed sharply through his nose. Ethan was already moving. He took a strip of oiled cloth, folded it, pressed it into the seam with the flat of a knife, then drove a narrow wedge in. And behind it. The snow dust stopped. He held his bare fingers near the repair for 3 breaths. No blade of air. He sat back on his heels. "You're earning overtime," he told Coda. Coda blinked once, solemn and unimpressed, like a priest who had heard too many confessions to be flattered. The storm deepened after dark. It became less a series of gusts than one long force trying to erase edges from the world. The shelter trembled, but it did not argue with the storm in the old cabin's way. The cabin had stood in the clearing like a proud fool, taking every blow on its chest. This place bowed its head into the rock. It made itself small. It let the stone carry the first violence. Ethan understood that now in his bones. There had been a time, not long ago in years but far away in spirit, when he had believed survival meant becoming harder than whatever struck him, harder than grief, harder than memory, harder than the silence after coming home and finding no one waiting with a place already made. But the storm shelter taught another law. Sometimes the thing that lived was not the strongest. Sometimes it was the thing willing to change shape. At 8:17 p.m., the radio cracked. The first burst was only static. Ethan reached for the handset. "This is Hale." Static answered. Then Ray Caldwell's voice came in broken, distorted by distance and weather. "North Road. Multiple outages. Tree down near mile marker 6. Sheriff's line overloaded. You holding? Holding. Repeat? We're holding. A pause. Then beneath Ray's voice, another transmission bled through on the emergency frequency. A woman's voice. Thin, shaking, fighting not to break. Is anyone there? Please, can anyone hear me? Ethan's hand tightened. Ray said, Stand by, Hale. We're getting cross-traffic. The woman came again. This is Martha Keene, at the store. The back roof. Part of it came off. Cold's coming in. Nora's with me. The shelter seemed to grow still around Ethan. Not the storm. The storm raged on, but some inner room inside him went silent. Martha, he said into the radio. This is Ethan Hale. I hear you. There was a burst of static, then her breath. For a moment, she was not the woman behind the counter, not the sharp blue eyes, not the mouth that had made laughter into a weapon. She was only an old woman in a storm with a child beside her. She's cold, Martha said. How cold? She's shaking. I've got coats on her. Stove's still lit in the front, but the storage room opened up. I can't block it. Door's jammed. I tried. Her voice cracked on that last word. Ethan stood. Coda stood with him. Where are you in the building? Front store. Behind the counter. Glass is holding. For now. Stay away from the back room. Put Nora close to the stove, but not against it. Wrap her head and neck. Feet off the floor if you can. Do you have blankets? Yes. Use flour sacks under the blankets if they're dry. Anything dry traps air. Yes. Ray's voice cut in. Hale, roads are near zero visibility. Do not attempt long travel. It's not long, Ethan said. Ray understood what that meant and hated it. You can't get the whole town. I'm not trying to. He looked at the wall where the rope coils hung. One line was already tied to an anchor point inside the shelter and looped around a pine outside the crevice mouth. From there, he had marked a short route down toward the lower trail with reflective strips. Beyond that, visibility would decide how much arrogance the night would punish. Coda moved to the entrance and waited. Ethan pulled on his coat, checked his gloves, clipped a small rescue sled line to his belt, and took the flare gun from its hook. He packed 2 wool blankets, a thermos, and a medical pouch. His old military watch read 8:24. Mason was not here. Jonah was somewhere in town. Martha was waiting. Nora was cold. That was enough. Before Ethan opened the shelter door, Coda turned away from the storm and pressed his forehead briefly against Ethan's thigh. It lasted less than 2 seconds. Not fear, not hesitation. A touch. A reminder. For one breath, Ethan felt the old ghosts behind him, the men who had not come home, the doors he had been too late to reach. Dachim, the prayers muttered into radio static in other storms with other names. Then Coda lifted his head and stepped toward the white darkness. The door opened. The world attacked. Snow hit Ethan sideways, hard as thrown sand. The wind shoved at his shoulders, tried to turn his body, tried to steal breath from his mouth. The rope line snapped tight in his gloved hand. He lowered his center of gravity and followed Coda. The dog did not run. Running killed men in whiteouts. Coda moved with controlled certainty, head low, body angled against the pressure. His paws found the packed root near the rock, then the shallow dip beyond, then the first reflective strip tied to a branch. Ethan kept one hand on the rope until the marked line ended. From there, he clipped a second line to the sled and moved tree to tree where he could. The storm had taken away distance. Trees appeared only when they were close enough to become dangerous. The road was not a road anymore, only a paler darkness beneath moving snow. More than once, Ethan stopped and let Coda test the air. The dog would lift his muzzle, turn slightly, then choose a direction, not by magic, but by memory, scent, pressure, and the old animal knowledge of how wind carried the world. Near the first bend of the North Road, they found Jonah Bell. He was struggling beside a half-buried snowmobile, his sandy hair iced at the edges beneath his cap, goggles fogged, one cheek raw from windburn. A tow rope dragged behind him. "Hail!" Jonah shouted, though the storm tore the word into pieces. Ethan reached him and grabbed his sleeve. "What happened?" "Generator line at the store failed. I tried to get there. Machine died. I can walk." "You can follow rope?" Jonah nodded too fast. Ethan looked at him carefully. Young, scared, but still thinking. "Good. You're with me. Stay behind. Hold the sled line." Jonah saw Coda and almost laughed, but the sound came out like relief. "Dog knows better than I do." "Usually." They pushed on. Northridge appeared in fragments, a porch light swinging wildly, sparks somewhere beyond a downed line, the groan of tin roofing peeling back from a shed. A barn door banged open and shut in the dark like something alive trying to escape. A chimney cap flew across the street and vanished. The general store was half lit. One front window had cracked but not broken. The sign above the porch hung by one bracket, slamming against the building in dull, heavy blows. Snow poured into the side alley where the back storage roof had failed. Ethan reached the front door. It would not open. Martha had said jammed. She had been right. Jonah stumbled beside him. Side entrance? Too exposed. Ethan took the small pry bar from his pack, set it into the lower edge, and worked the swollen frame. The door resisted like pride. Then Coda barked once from the left side of the porch. Ethan looked. The dog had found the old delivery hatch near the window, half blocked by crates. Smaller, lower, sheltered by the counter overhang. Jonah understood at once. Together, they dragged 2 crates aside. Ethan kicked the hatch loose, then crawled in first. Heat hit his face, weak, but real. "Martha! Here!" She was behind the counter, wrapped in a brown coat, silver hair fallen loose from its bun. Without the store as her kingdom around her, she looked smaller. Not weak. Never that. But stripped of performance. Her face was pale, eyes wide, and wet with cold air and fear. Nora lay curled on a pile of coats near the stove, purple jacket zipped to her chin, red hat crooked over dark curls. Her lips were pale, and she trembled in hard little waves. One mittened hand clutched the wooden toy horse Ethan had seen before. Martha looked at him. No sarcasm survived that look. "I called," she said, as if confessing a sin. "I know." He checked Nora quickly. Responsive, cold, frightened, but not gone into the dangerous stillness yet. "Hi, Nora," Ethan said. "Coda came to see you." The girl's eyes opened a little wider. Coda pushed through the hatch behind Jonah, shook snow from his coat, and stepped near the child. He did not crowd her. He simply lowered himself beside the pile of coats, warm body close enough to comfort, calm enough to steady the room. Nora's shaking changed. Not stopped. Changed. Martha pressed a hand over her mouth. Ethan looked away, granting her the mercy of privacy even in a crowded room. They could not stay in the store, not with the back opened and the roof damage spreading. Ethan made that decision quickly. He wrapped Nora in 2 more layers, secured her on the rescue sled, and gave Martha instructions in short, clear words. Jonah found extra blankets, lantern oil, and a bag of dry socks. Martha, to her credit, did not argue once. As they prepared to leave, another call came through the handheld radio. Cole Drayton's voice, strained now. No laugh left. "Roof's gone on the north shed. My wife's ankle's bad. We can hold in the pantry. Need guidance." Ethan closed his eyes for half a second. Not everyone. Not tonight. He keyed the radio. "Cole, listen carefully. Move everyone to the smallest interior room. Blankets over the door. Mattresses against the north wall if you can move them. Water near the stove, not against the exterior wall. Do not try to come out unless fire or collapse forces you." A pause. Then Cole said, quieter than Ethan had ever heard him, "Copy." That was all Ethan could give him. He hated it. But hatred did not change distance. They left through the delivery hatch. The return was slower. Nora was strapped to the sled beneath blankets and sacks. Martha held one side rope. Jonah took the other. Ethan led. Coda ranged just ahead, never far enough to vanish, always returning to the line of movement. Twice the wind knocked Martha to one knee. Twice she got up without a word. Her face had become a mask of effort. Fear for the child pulled her forward better than pride ever could. At the edge of the preserve, a shape emerged from the snow. Mason. The old carpenter stood tied to the first rope line, lantern in hand, coat crusted white, beard frozen at the edges. Ethan felt anger flare before relief could catch it. "I told you not to come if it was bad," Mason shouted back. "The next time, give better orders." There was no time for more. Together, they guided the small group up to the crevice. Inside the shelter, the world changed again. Not peaceful, not safe in the soft way people liked, but survivable. The stove glowed. The stones around it had begun to hold heat. The canvas barrier snapped behind them as they entered, taking the first bite of cold. Ethan and Mason moved quickly. Nora to the warmest corner, dry socks on her feet, blankets layered around her, warm water in small sips. Coda lay beside her again, close enough that her mittened fingers found his fur. Martha stood just inside the entrance, shaking now that she no longer needed to move. Her eyes traveled over the shelter, the low roof, the rough timber, the stones, the ugly canvas, the sealed seams, the tiny space that had looked like madness when described from the warmth of her store. "It's holding," she whispered. Ethan did not say yes. He was already checking the lower seam where the gusts had shifted. Jonah helped without being asked. Mason directed him with short instructions. Martha, after 1 minute of standing uselessly in shock, removed her coat and began hanging blankets where Mason pointed. Then she unpacked what they had brought: dry socks, lamp oil, 2 tins of crackers, a folded quilt from the store shelf, and a bundle of candles. More radio calls came. Some they could not reach. Some they could guide. One elderly couple from the North Road made it halfway before Ethan and Coda met them at the rope line and brought them in. A trapper named Ben Lask, thin as a rail and wrapped in a wolf-gray coat, arrived with a pack of jerky and 3 extra blankets, cursing the storm with such creativity that even Mason paused in admiration. Ben was a solitary man in his late 50s, with a long, weathered face, a broken nose, and pale eyes used to distance. He did not speak much after entering, but he immediately began stacking snow outside into a crude wind wall, as if apology could be performed with frozen hands. By midnight, the shelter held more people than comfort allowed. Not the whole town, not even close. But enough. Nora slept in uneven breaths beside Coda. Martha sat near her, one hand on the child's shoulder, the other holding a tin cup she had not drunk from. Jonah dozed sitting up, then woke every time the wind struck harder. Mason watched the frame like a man listening to a verdict. Ben kept feeding small wood to the stove, never too much at once. Ethan moved constantly. He repaired a seam, shifted a blanket, checked Nora, answered radio calls, told Cole again to stay inside, told Ray the shelter was occupied and holding, told a frightened woman 3 miles south how to block a broken kitchen window with a mattress and tarp from inside. At some point, Martha stood beside him near the entrance. For a long time, she said nothing. Then, quietly, beneath the storm and the breathing of crowded people, she said, "I laughed because I was scared." Ethan looked at her. Her face was older now, or perhaps only more honest. The sharpness remained, but it no longer pointed outward. "I know," he said. She swallowed. "No," she whispered. "You don't. Not yet." He did not press. Outside, the storm roared like an ancient beast denied entry. Inside, imperfect people kept each other warm. The shelter was small, ugly, unfinished, inconvenient in every possible way, but it held. And for that night, holding was a kind of grace. Morning came without sunrise. For a long while, there was only a slow thinning of darkness inside the storm shelter, a grayness gathering beyond the canvas barrier and the low wooden door. The wind had not stopped. It had grown tired, perhaps, or bored of striking the same stone and receiving so little obedience in return. It still moved over the ridge in long, bitter breaths, but the violence had lost its first hunger. Ethan Hale had not slept more than 20 minutes at a time. He sat near the stove with one shoulder against the stone, his old military gray tactical shirt creased and darkened with sweat beneath his coat. His clean-shaven face looked harder in the pale light, the square jaw roughened only by exhaustion, the gray-blue eyes still awake even when the body beneath them asked to collapse. A thin cut crossed one knuckle where he had driven a wedge too fast in the night. He had wrapped it with cloth and forgotten it. Around him, the shelter breathed with people. Not comfortably. Comfort had never entered the place as a guest, but alive. Nora Keene slept in a nest of blankets near the warmest stones, her dark curls flattened beneath the red knit hat, one small hand still tangled in Coda's cream-gray fur. The German shepherd lay beside her, amber eyes half open, body curved with patient care. Snow had dried along the edges of his black harness, leaving pale salt-like marks on the dark red trim. He had not slept deeply either. Each time the wind shifted, one ear rose. Each time Nora stirred, his tail gave the smallest thump against the floor. Martha Keene sat upright beside the child. The sharp-tongued queen of the general store looked unlike herself in the morning's dimness. Her silver hair had come loose from its bun, hanging in thin strands around her face. Her blue eyes were red-rimmed, and her hands, those strong hands that had counted change, stacked flour, and pointed judgment across a counter for decades, rested uselessly in her lap. She had spent the final hours of the storm watching the shelter hold, and there was a kind of wreckage in that too, not of wood or roof, but of certainty. Mason Rourke was asleep, sitting up, chin on his chest, one hand still gripping a carpenter's pencil, as if even dreams might require measurements. Jonah Bell dozed near the entrance, wrapped in a quilt from Martha's store. Ben Lask, the old trapper, stood outside the first barrier for several minutes at a time, checking the snow wall he had built, then returning with his beard glittering white and his expression as flat as stone. Ethan rose when the radio finally spoke. Ray Caldwell's voice came through broken but clearer than it had been in the night. "Hale, you copy?" Ethan lifted the handset. "I copy." You still holding? Ethan looked around the shelter. The patched seams, the sleeping child, the old carpenter, the dog, the woman who no longer had a joke ready. We're holding. There was a silence. Then Ray exhaled hard enough for the radio to catch it. Good. Roads are bad. Power's out across most of Northridge. We've got damage reports coming in. No confirmed fatalities. Ethan closed his eyes for 1 second. No confirmed fatalities. The words did not erase the night. They did not fix the roofs, the barns, the hands gone numb from digging through snow. But they mattered. In the old wars of weather and human pride, survival was never too small a victory to name. We're moving when visibility improves, Ethan said. Need to check the north road. Wait for daylight. This is daylight. Ray gave a humorless laugh. God help us. Ethan set down the radio. Martha was looking at him. No one died? She asked. Ray said none confirmed. Her mouth trembled once, and she pressed her lips together hard, as if emotion were another draft she could block if she worked fast enough. Nora woke when Coda shifted. The child opened her eyes and stared at the stone ceiling above her. Are we in the mountain? She whispered. Ben Lask, standing near the entrance, muttered, Close enough. Nora turned her head and saw Coda. Her fingers tightened in his fur. Did he save us? Ethan looked at the dog. Coda yawned, wide and undignified, revealing the pink tongue and large teeth of an animal who had no interest in mythology before breakfast. Mason opened one eye. That means yes. For the first time since the storm began, someone laughed. It was small, broken at the edges, but it was laughter without armor. They left the shelter in groups after the wind eased enough to permit movement. The world outside had been rearranged. Snow lay in carved shapes, not soft blankets, but hard drifts sculpted by force. The old cabin in the clearing had lost part of its roof. One wall bowed inward. The boards Ethan had not yet stripped now twisted and split. The porch had collapsed entirely, buried under snow and broken timber. Ethan stood looking at it for a moment. There was no triumph in seeing it ruined, no satisfaction. A failed shelter was not an enemy. It was a warning that had done its best to arrive early. Mason came to stand beside him, leaning on a cut branch he had taken for a walking stick. If you'd stayed in that, the old man said. I know. The words were enough. Down toward Northridge, the damage grew clearer. Jonah's back shed had survived because he had braced it. One corner had shifted, but the roof remained. The old couple's house on the North Road had lost a porch screen, but the interior room they had sealed stayed warm enough. Cole Drayton's north shed had torn open like a paper box, but his family had remained in the pantry as Ethan instructed, frightened and cold, but safe. Cole met Ethan outside his farmhouse near mid-morning. The big rancher looked smaller without his laugh. His black beard was rimed with frost, his sheepskin coat torn at one sleeve, one cheek bruised where something had struck him in the dark. Behind him, his wife sat wrapped in blankets near the kitchen stove, her injured ankle propped on a chair. Cole did not apologize, not with words. He held out a coil of heavy rope and a box of galvanized brackets. For the shelter, he said. Ethan took them. Thank you. Cole nodded once and looked away toward the ruined shed. It was not humility fully born yet, but it was kicking hard inside the shell. At Martha's general store, the back storage roof had partly collapsed. Flour sacks lay ruined under snow. One side wall had cracked where the wind had found the failed roofline and pried like a thief. The front of the store still stood, stove chimney intact, windows cracked but unbroken. Martha stood in the doorway with Nora against her side. People gathered there through the morning. Jonah, Cole, Ben, Mason, Ray Caldwell in his preserve truck, and half a dozen others with red faces, tired eyes, and hands full of tools, blankets, or coffee. They did not gather because anyone called a meeting. They gathered because after a storm, people needed to see who remained. Ray stepped out of his truck, moving stiffly. He was broad and tired, his mustache iced at the edges, his preserve coat dusted white from the drive. Practicality still lived in his face, but something had shifted behind it. Budget lines had met weather and lost the argument. He looked at Ethan. "I saw the old cabin." Ethan said nothing. Ray looked toward the ridge. "And the shelter?" Holding. "So I heard." Ray's jaw worked once. "I'll file it as an emergency storm structure. Official. Temporary until inspected, but official." Mason snorted. "Temporary is what bureaucrats call things they hope will outlive them." Ray gave him a look. "Good morning to you too, Mason." "It is now." Martha stepped forward before the exchange could grow teeth. The street quieted. For years, Martha Keene had known how to hold a room. With a raised eyebrow. With a word. With the authority of someone who had seen people come and go, while her store remained in the center of town like a second church, less forgiving, but better stocked. Now she stood without performance. Nora's small hand held the edge of her coat. Martha looked at Ethan first, then at Mason, then at the people gathered in the snow. "I laughed," she said. No one answered. The wind moved softly down the street, touching the cracked sign above the store. It creaked once, but did not fall. "I laughed because I was afraid," Martha continued. "Afraid of another man with another idea. Afraid folks would believe in something strange and get hurt. Afraid that if I admitted he might be right, then I'd have to admit I'd been wrong before." Her voice thinned, but she did not stop. "I made my fear sound like wisdom." That sentence settled over the street more heavily than snow. Coda left Ethan's side and walked to Martha. The German shepherd did not wag or beg. He simply sat in front of her, amber eyes lifted to her face. Martha stared down at him. For one strange, tender second, the woman who had mocked the rock house looked as though judgment had come not from heaven, nor from town, nor from the man she had doubted, but from the quiet creature who had led them all into safety, without ever needing to be right. Then Coda leaned forward and placed his chin against Nora's mitten. The child smiled, and Martha broke. Not loudly. She covered her mouth, shoulders shaking once, then twice, while Nora wrapped both arms around her waist. No one moved to rescue her from the moment. Some truths, like grief, had to finish crossing the room on their own legs. When she lowered her hand, her face was wet. "I'm sorry," she said to Ethan. He nodded. "I'm sorry," she said again, this time to Mason. The old carpenter looked down at his boots. "Took you long enough," he said. It should have sounded cruel. It did not. Martha laughed once through tears. By afternoon, the first real work began. Not rebuilding, not yet. People were too tired for full reconstruction and too shaken to pretend a single day could undo the storm. They cleared doors, checked chimneys, counted livestock, moved the injured to warmer rooms, covered broken windows from inside. Shared dry socks, coffee, canned soup, lantern oil. Ethan did not stand above them and teach. He moved among them. He pointed to how the wind had peeled Cole's shed from the north edge. He showed Jonah how the angled brace had changed the way pressure hit his wall. Mason drew with a carpenter's pencil on scrapboards. Wind direction, buffer space, low roof line, snow wall, stone backing, inner warm room. Ray took notes because official things were often born from unofficial survival. "What worked?" Ray asked. Ethan pointed toward the ridge. "The stone took the first hit. The entrance sat off the main line. Canvas made the cold knock twice. Raised floor slowed ground chill. Stones near the stove held heat." Cole frowned. "Not everyone has a rock split behind their place." "No," Ethan said. "That's not the lesson." Mason lifted his pencil. "The lesson is not to copy the shelter. The lesson is to stop giving the wind a clean invitation." That became the sentence people repeated. Stop giving the wind a clean invitation. It sounded simple enough for children and deep enough for old men. Near sunset, Mason returned to his workshop and came back carrying a rolled paper case wrapped in oilcloth. His movements were slow, but his face held a kind of fierce embarrassment, like a man bringing out a love letter found after 40 years in a drawer. He unrolled the old design on the counter of Martha's damaged store. The paper was yellowed at the edges. Pencil lines showed a low storm refuge built against stone. Double entry. Angled windbreak. Interior stove. Storage wall. Reinforced roof. Drainage channel. The drawing was careful, beautiful in its humility. People leaned in. No one laughed. Mason stood very still. Martha touched the corner of the paper with 2 fingers. "You kept it," she said. Mason's mouth tightened. "I hid it." "Not anymore," Ethan said. The old man looked at him. Then, slowly, Mason pinned the drawing to the inside wall of the general store, right beside a cracked shelf where peppermint jars had fallen in the night. He used 2 bent nails and a hammer from Jonah's toolbox. Each strike sounded small, final. By dusk, Ray Caldwell had agreed to request emergency funds to expand the preserve shelter into an official storm refuge. Cole promised stone from his north field. Jonah offered generator work. Ben Lask, without being asked, said he knew where packed snow walls held best along the ridge. Martha offered the store as a supply point and then, after a pause, added that she would stop insulting the project unless it became truly stupid. "That's generous," Mason said. "It's a process," Martha replied. The humor was still there, but its blade had been dulled by truth. Ethan stood outside the store as evening settled, Coda beside him. Northridge looked wounded under the fading light. Roof lines broken. Smoke rising crooked. Snow piled against doors. The town had lost things. Some would take weeks to repair. Some losses would appear later, when people opened bills, counted animals, remembered how close the night had come. But the town was alive. And more than that, it was listening. Coda leaned his shoulder against Ethan's leg. Ethan rested a hand on the dog's neck, feeling the warmth beneath the thick fur. In stories, men liked to say they saved the day. Ethan knew better. The day had been saved by many things too small for songs. A dog stopping at a rabbit's path, a carpenter unrolling an old shame, a strip of cloth moving in a draft, a child's hand in a dog's fur, an old woman brave enough to say she had been afraid. The storm had not made them stronger. It had made them honest. Above the town, the ridge darkened. Somewhere beyond it, the crevice shelter held its place in the stone, small and rough and stubborn as a prayer carved into granite. Ethan did not feel victorious. Victory was too loud a word. He felt the quiet beginning of belonging. Not because Northridge had welcomed him easily, but because, at last, it had stopped laughing long enough to hear the wind. And sometimes, in this world, that was how a community began again. Sometimes, a miracle does not arrive as thunder from the sky. Sometimes, it comes quietly, through a dog that refuses to ignore the wind, through an old man who finally dares to believe in the dream he once buried, through a stranger who keeps building even while others laugh. Maybe God does not always move the storm away from us. Maybe sometimes He teaches us where to stand, who to trust, and how to listen before the storm arrives. In everyday life, we all face our own kind of blizzard. It may be doubt, loneliness, failure, judgment, or the cruel laughter of people who do not understand what we are trying to build. But this story reminds us that we should not let other people's words become the walls of our prison. If God places an idea in your heart, do not bury it just because others cannot see it yet. Build carefully. Build humbly. Build with faith. And when the storm comes, the thing they once laughed at may become the shelter that saves more lives than your own. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs courage today. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from. And if you believe stories like this still matter, please subscribe to the channel so we can continue creating meaningful stories of faith, loyalty, courage, and hope. May God bless you, protect your home, guide your steps, and give you the strength to keep building what He has placed inside your heart.